What's going on, guys? Welcome back to the You Know Ball podcast. I am your host, Trill Bro Dude, and today I am excited to have onto the podcast a regular here from Liberty Ballers from Clutch Point Apps. We have Dave Early. What's going on, Dave?
What's going on?
Not much, man. I've seen this movie 1,000 times before. The Sixers are the
Joker?
Sixers. Yes, this feels like the Joker. I'm being Jokerfied currently by many people within the Sixers organization, but specifically, they bounced back from their recent cold streak that they had. They lost 3 in a row, including a massive loss, what felt like a massive loss to the Pistons at the time. And two games that came down to the wire against the Suns and the Bucks. They bounce back. They destroy the Hornets. They beat the Cavs down at the wire, and then they almost blow a lead to the lowly Pacers, and they end up winning. But once again, it feels like the same shit we've seen before. The parallels to the 2018-2019 season are getting weird. Like at this point, if you think about it, people have pointed this out before. I'm not the first one to point this out, but it does feel very similar to that season in regards of making big in-season trade for a star, Jimmy Butler, James Harden. Okay. Kind of figuring things out on the fly.
Are you saying Harden offers about the impact that Harris does?
No. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that I think that the parallels,
Just kidding,
when it comes to the second star being traded for in the season, or third star at the time, whatever you consider him, the fact that you have, this backup center situation that feels untenable going into the playoffs. Also, you have the fact that they literally might finish with the same exact record, 51-31, depending on how they finish these final 3 games. It's just weird, and it feels like Joel Embiid will have to absolutely be a destroyer of worlds in the playoffs for the Sixers to have any legit shot at a conference finals or finals run.
Yeah, I think you nailed it. You'd have to go. I'm trying to think of the equivalent, like finals run. Dwight Howard was, he's not quite as good as this version of Embiid, but he was so dominant in that day. And they were built really well around him. The Sixers are a little clunkier around Embiid at this point. The James Harden, Joel Embiid pick and roll is lethal, but how much more lethal would it be if you just had like Robert Covington's on the platoon rather than guys who don't love to catch and shoot? So,
although that does feel like it's changing a little bit, I think that I will give Maxey and Tobias credit for kind of
the stats against Indiana.
Well, juicing the stats against Indiana, but Tobias has had how many games now that he shot 8 or 9 threes? I mean, it ultimately, since James Harden has got here, it took a little bit of an adjustment period. And I think some of that is definitely teams not trying as much down the stretch. I don't really take too much from this stretch of the season, whether it's the good or the bad. But I look at the fact that the Sixers, the role players, so the two, the way that Tobias has been playing offensively has been encouraging. The way that Maxey has, last night almost broke the record, by the way. I don't know if you realize this. He was 1 3 short of breaking the Sixers record for threes in a game. They both have been more willing to let it fly.
Who holds that? Is it Dana Barros?
It's Dana Barros and Danny Green, who Danny had a 9-game 3-pointers made last year. He made 9, but he also shot 21 in that game.
Wow.
Maxey, I believe, finished the game last night 8 for 11 or 8 for 12 from 3. Like, he was just absolutely making it rain, was not missing anything. And since James Harden has got here, Maxey is actually shooting like 50% from 3. Tobias is up over 40%. Thybulle's percentage has gone up. I think that although the thing with Thybulle is that his volume's so low on threes and he's left so open that you don't really know what to take from that. And Thybulle, of all the things, you're right about the pick and roll with James Harden and Joel Embiid being unstoppable, but it's everything else that I worry about around them. So the Thybulle being left open every time, that's an easy decision. You put 3 in the paint, make it so that Thybulle has to beat you instead of Harden and Embiid. And then the backup center situation, which is something that has been completely unavoidable for the Sixers for ever now. It's, you know, it's one thing, like we've solved one thing, we create another problem with this trade, and losing Andre Drummond turned out to be even bigger than I could have imagined. Even though I was worried about it, I figured they would be able to figure out a way. But the way that DeAndre Jordan has looked in 3 of the last 4 games, being a negative 10 or 11 in 9 minutes, is extremely concerning to me going into the playoffs.
Yeah, I mean, this is a conversation we have at this point every year. You mentioned the parallels going back to 2018, 2019. Literally 3 years ago, we were having this conversation. Well, now that Embiid is banged up, and do we want to gun for the top seed and get the 3 seed with Boban, or do we want to tinker with Bolden and see what we have? And to Brett Brown's credit, he threw Bolden out there in the starting role, and they won some games with like a stretch big in Oklahoma. I'd like to see them doing that now. Really bad news that Bassey got hurt. Not that Doc would have used him, but I want to ask the Sixers, like, what would happen if you put Bassey in for these minutes? What would happen if you put DeAndre Jordan in the G League? Would he be dominating the same way that Charles Bassey has been? I doubt it.
I mean, at this point, I don't know if DeAndre Jordan could dominate at any level. He might dominate in a college game. I don't know if he could dominate in a G League game, a Euro League game. I think that those days are past him.
The
I don't know.
Peacocks could have used him.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, St. Peter's probably wins. St. Peter's beats UNC, or who did they lose to? UNC. Yeah, beats UNC with DeAndre Jordan. We can name that the title of this episode. But just ultimately, it's the Hawk series, but for St. Peter's. So
Yes.
Ultimately, when it comes to the Bassey thing, I've talked about it ad nauseum. Like the Bassey thing, the Reed thing. We all know that they're not going to get a chance. And that's what's most frustrating here. Just a little side note on there. Bassey did get hurt in a G League game last night. I think he did come back into the game. So I think that he's fine. I think that he just got banged up a little bit. So if he did need to play, which he won't, by the way, that's the most frustrating part about this. Part of me is like, it's DeAndre Jordan because his defense is so terrible and the only thing he can do is rebound now and occasionally catch lobs, but only when he's jumping up backwards for some reason. There's this weirdness surrounding it where, obviously we know Doc loves his old guys. He's going to play his guys, blah, 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 blah. All the same shit that I've said. But another part of it to me is the fact that it does feel as though this version of James Harden is incapable of carrying a backup lineup like he used to be able to. So I think that offensively they're going to be good with, they're dominant when Joel and Harden are on the court together. Without one of those two, either the defense falls off a cliff, like when Joel goes to the bench, the defense falls off a cliff. When Harden goes to the bench, the offense falls off a cliff. And those are going to be the minutes that you need to figure out how to survive in the playoffs. And ultimately, I do think that Harden not being 100% himself and the normal Harden that we are used to could create some issues because, like, not only is DeAndre Jordan horrible, but the depth from the bench is horrible. So figuring out those lineups is hard. Plus, you have the fact that Harden, maybe against a set playoff defense, might not be as effective offensively. And that is just a recipe for a disaster in the playoffs.
Yeah, it's scary. You watched the Pistons have so much success switching and slowing down James Harden that you can only imagine what Nick Nurse and the Nick Nurse looking shocked GIF are going to do to James Harden. I honestly, I think, like, I've talked so much as well about the backup center minutes, and I've like pulled my hair out trying to figure out the best way to utilize this rotation. But I feel like the whole thing is fruitless when I look at James Harden once in a while, And I think if he's going to be this version of himself, it's going to be really, really hard for this team to win the title, and I wouldn't bet on them to do that. So I started wondering, would I prefer them to just rest him through the playoffs if that would help, settle into, I guess that 4 seed where they would be hosting Toronto, but get a perhaps better version of him, the version that we saw when he got 2 weeks off after COVID or 2 weeks off after the trade. Maybe he'd get a little bit more flash back in his legs, because when I watch him now, I'm nervous. A loose ball goes near him, I don't want him to sprint towards it.
Yeah, it's concerning because I do think that It's hard because from what I have heard, by the way, not a hamstring expert by any means. Simon Rice is the one who's the hamstring expert on the Sixers, and apparently he's like written a papers about hamstrings and is like knows like a ton about them. They have him in house working with Harden every day. Apparently hamstrings aren't one of those things where it's like if you rest, it means that you're going to come. Like he looked better, but then he kind of regressed to his normal stuff. Like you can atrophy it if you rest it too long. Like there are things that can go wrong if you play, and there are things that can go wrong if you sit and rest through it
Right.
too. So it can go either direction. It's not like a 100% like you'll be better with rest kind of thing. So at this point, I think he's just kind of play through it and figure it out down the stretch here. Another thing, one thing that is concerning to me is like, I think playmaking, passing wise, he's been awesome, but it does feel a lot like the Ben Simmons conversation that we had last year, where, you know, in the playoffs, that passing and playmaking might not be there if he can't beat anyone in an ISO situation. He can't create advantages off of the dribble. No one's respecting, you know, obviously James Harden's a significantly better shooter than Ben Simmons, but no one's really respecting his shot as much as they usually do because none of the shots are falling and he can't create that same separation and get the same burst when he's driving, all of that shit. So
If you
all
leave
that
him
stuff,
wide open and they kick it out to him, you know he's got to dribble first so you can recover.
right? He resets the possession. One of the things that, you know, looked a little bit encouraging at least was in one of those games, I believe it was the Charlotte game, he shot 4 or 5 threes off the catch, and I was like, hey, we're making progress here. He made 2 of them. I was like, all right, maybe these things are being drilled into his head, similarly to the way that we had to kind of rewire Tobias and Maxey to shoot more off of the catch. Maybe Harden is starting to understand that as well, but the last 2 games we haven't really seen it at all. Once again, he catches it, he has an open 3, someone closes out, and he takes a sidestep 3 as the shot clock expires last night. Having said all that,
Yeah.
the Sixers offense, even though they're not going against the best defenses, I know that these defenses are not good. The Charlotte's defense is miserable. Indiana's defense is miserable, but it has been encouraging that they have now broken or tied the record for the most threes taken in a game by this team in franchise history over the past 3 games. So 2 games, they tied it against Charlotte. Niang probably would have broken it, but he passed the ball to Paul Reed on the last possession of the game and let him shoot one and did not go well. And then last night, Tobias Harris, I believe, hit a corner 3 to break the record. And you're looking, or maybe it was Niang, I can't remember, but you're looking at this team and you're saying, I feel like offensively, everything begins and ends with this version, what version of Harden we're going to get. So if we get a slightly improved version of James Harden, we get maybe he just doesn't really care about scoring right now because the shot isn't falling and he's kind of phoning it in. Seems like no one's playing defense down the stretch here. Maybe all of that goes away in the playoffs. Maybe he comes back. Maybe keep in mind, the play-in is how long? The play-in's 4 days, I believe. We have
The 12th to the 15th or something.
Right. So we will get a week rest between the end of the regular season and the playoffs. Hey, if the Sixers have seeding locked up and they want to tank to that 4 seed and play Toronto in the first round, or maybe Chicago, if Chicago can somehow win against a good fucking team, which they can't seem to do, which is why we want them in the first round.
Yeah.
If that is the case, they are going to have an extended period of time off here because it's like, you know, you have 6 or 7 days rest, and then if you miss the Pistons game, it could be even longer.
Yeah, they might think that that's just enough time. And you mentioned, was it Francis Zomes on Twitter who was like, I've only just heard of him 2 days ago, but I'm placing my entire faith in Simon Rice's hands now. And so maybe he feels like I got to push.
Simon Rice pilled.
Yeah, pretty much.
That's what someone said to me.
And yeah, if that 4 days, like, you know, because you mentioned the risk of resting, but you don't have to not do anything on those rest days. Maybe there's a way you can, you know, not ramp up to game speed, but still keep fresh, but limit your workload essentially and be ready to go for that first round. And maybe that's what they're targeting. Maybe that's why they're not going to load management down the stretch here.
Yeah, I mean, I'm starting to think that ultimately what what is probably best is just playing him, keeping him in game shape, kind of figuring it out down the stretch here, and not maybe overthinking it. Just kind of like, you're going to get a week off either way. Even if you play, if you don't play, you're going to get extended period of time off. And I think ultimately what Sixers will probably end up doing is probably playing him at least a little bit so that he's not completely out of shape when we get back in for the playoffs, because those minutes are going to ramp up even more in the playoffs. And the one major, so the two major, I shouldn't even say like, I would just say the positive things I can take out of the last few games are the Sixers' willingness to shoot threes, shoot open threes, literally breaking records amazingly, which is, I mean, I know the Sixers have never been historically a three-point shooting team, but it has been encouraging even against these bad defenses that they're not even thinking about it. They're hitting their shots. They're confident in that regard. So that's an encouraging thing. The other encouraging thing is Joel Embiid is just fucking destroying everyone and proving why he should be, if not the MVP runner-up this season. And I think that it's hard because, so right now I told you before the podcast that it feels like we haven't played Toronto yet. Tomorrow, the Toronto game kind of will determine whether the Sixers are going to gun for that 2 or 3 seed, or they're going to end up in the 4 seed. Because if they lose to Toronto, they're almost sealing a Toronto 4-5 matchup in the first round, which, you know, I don't love the Toronto matchup. Joel has even since he's made his leap, has historically struggled versus Nick Nurse and the Raptors defense. They seemingly don't have anyone who can guard him. They have no one over 6'9", and he still continues to, like, the last Toronto game was probably the worst combination Harden and Embiid offensive game that we've had from them so far since Harden got here. It seems like they are able to have the team defense, the long, scrappy defenders to be able to bother both Joel and James. And what it will come down to is, because of the fact that the Celtics and the Bucks play, the Celtics and the Bulls play, that ultimately for the Sixers to get the 2 or the 3 seed, they have to win out. So they have to win that game against Toronto, then they have to win the last 2. My personal path, there are a few different paths that they can try to take. I think you just try to win your games and figure out the rest later. If you end up in the 2 or the 3 seed, you know, you might end up, if you get the 2 seed, it's possible you get Brooklyn first round. And I don't think that's a matchup we should be gunning for, because I think I would probably prefer Toronto or Chicago. Oh, I definitely would prefer Chicago. I'd probably prefer Toronto over Brooklyn. But ultimately, the way that the schedule is matching, because all these teams are playing each other, because the Celtics play the Bucks and they play the Bulls, like the way that the schedule has shaken out, it's basically got to the point where the Sixers control their own destiny if they want to get the 3 seed, but it's highly likely that they end up in the 4-5 versus Toronto, and then they get Miami potentially in the second round if they win that first round series, versus getting the Bucks in the second round or the Celtics in the second round. And I definitely would prefer that Miami matchup over those 2 teams, or Brooklyn as well.
Yeah, I don't feel I have enough of a sample of the Celtics without Robert Williams to be confident that I prefer the Heat. But I agree, because of the possibility of having to go to visit Milwaukee for round 2, I'd much rather the Heat in that bracket.
Yeah, it's tough. It's very tough.
I'll bite my tongue.
Figuring out, I feel like I can't say the word tough on this podcast
Not anymore.
Yeah, it's truly ruined. But
you know what's interesting?
I find it to be interesting that so obviously we want the Bulls in the first round, and we've made no they have owned the Bulls for years. Joel's never lost to the Bulls. It's a favorable matchup. Lonzo Ball's out for the rest of the season. The Bulls have absolutely sputtered down the stretch of this season. They can't beat anyone that is good. I think that everyone wants that first round matchup. But does the upside of destroying the Bulls in the first round, is that worth it for the downside of potentially facing a team that you don't match up well with in the second round? Whereas, like, I think that on paper, there is no fucking way in the world the Sixers should lose to the Raptors. There is no world in which we should lose to them. But because of the things I've talked about with DeAndre Jordan and Doc Rivers, I can't put any, like I said it earlier, I could see a world where Embiid's like a plus 100 in that series and we lose.
Yeah, I mean, you make the case that you have to be worried about this series most because of the coaching disparity that we predict will take shape. I feel like Nick Nurse doing some things that have plagued Joel Embiid over the course of his career might be good for one game that they win, and then their crowd is really, really good. There's some studies that say the louder an arena or stadium is, the more errors the officials make in favor of the home team. So
wow.
So, you start to, it's not hard to imagine a game where the crew is like, oh, I'm not going to put up with these bonus brothers bullwhack. So maybe that's worth one game. And then maybe Doc Rivers making some weird, I'm going to bench Joel and James Harden while also playing Paul Millsap. And, Fred VanVleet drops 13 in a row in that sequence. And we're talking about it for the next 10 years.
It's insane to me that we're even having this conversation, to be honest, because I think even with just like a normal coach, and even once again, going back to the thing that I talked about the last episode, like Daryl Morey has to take some blame in this. He should never have signed DeAndre Jordan. He should have never traded for Paul Millsap. He should have known that he cannot trust Doc Rivers to do the right thing. And he needs to literally cut these guys. I joked about it last episode, but like, I'm serious now. Like, keep them around for vibes or whatever, but like have a talk, because ultimately I guess if this is really the issue, and this is something that we'll get into with our next conversation right here, is if they're going to lose to the Raptors in the first round, which should not ever be a possibility, they should easily beat the Raptors in 4, 5, or 6. They have Joel Embiid and James Harden, and even though this is not the peak version of James Harden, with those two, you should never even have a threat of losing it. And especially considering the way that Embiid has played down the stretch of this season, and the fact that he is the MVP of the league, probably. And you look at it and you go, like, if they are going to lose to the Raptors, or they're going to lose to a team that they realistically should beat in the first or second round, then why is Doc Rivers the coach of this team? Because now we're starting to get these Lakers rumors. We're getting tension between Doc and Morey rumors coming out, which I've heard for a little bit, but like I didn't know how true they were, so I didn't really say anything. And then
where have you heard that?
So I don't want to disclose my sources, but it's someone that I think is like legit plugged in that has told me that they've heard some things regarding I have sources, very important. But
well, I think the tea leaves alone could have pointed you there at times. Like when Daryl Morey signed Dwight Howard, he said now there's a lot of very, very creative things that the team can do. They have all the tools, meaning Dwight Howard is a tool, but I didn't want you to change your light bulbs with this hammer. And like we saw the entire year, Dwight was simply penciled in for 12 minutes, and Dwight now is much better than what we're seeing from DeAndre Jordan, who appears penciled in for his 10 minutes. And it makes even less sense. He signs Anthony Tolliver, and you see Doc go out and say, well, what do you want me to do? Bench Tobias? And we're all like, no, bench Mike Scott or Dwight Howard. So things like that made me wonder, like, are they clashing? Like, surely Daryl is showing him the plus minus of this lineup and that lineup. Fast forward to today, and it makes sense that they are not getting the best out of each other. Like, sometimes I worry, if you have Daryl Morey, that's great because you want the insight that he offers. Like, he might recommend we need to be shooting 10 more threes per game. And to your point earlier, maybe the Sixers listened to him and they did that. He played a big part in revolutionizing the NBA with Mike D'Antoni. When he has these really creative ideas, are they implementing them now under Doc? Because I'm not sure that they're doing that level of experimentation.
I think having Harden definitely helps because it's kind of like having a coach on the floor in some ways. I think that the 3-point shooting thing is definitely, obviously, a big part of his game and creating open threes for people. I think those kind of things can, go a long way when Harden is on the court, when Embiid is on the court. But ultimately, they're not the ones who are making the rotational decisions, and that is going to be Doc Rivers, and that could cause a clashing. And it seems like the seeds are being planted right now, whether it's in the media or just things that are being leaked from Maury's side or whoever's leaking this stuff, is basically saying the Jake Fisher piece, which is tying Doc to the Lakers and, potentially the
Jazz.
Jazz. I don't really know how much I believe the Jazz part of it, but I think that those kind of things coming out now are planting the seeds. Like, they kind of see where this is going, where it's like, if there's a chance, it's very similar to when Brett Brown was, on the hot seat a few years ago, 2018, 2019, where if there's a chance that the team kind of flames out in the playoffs, we have this backup option that we can fall back on and say, okay, get rid of Doc and let's figure out things with a different roster and a different coach, and we'll go from there. Once again, something Derek Bodner said when he came on the podcast, this only really happens when a GM's starting to feel pressure. So maybe making the Harden trade in season put a little bit of pressure on Daryl Morey and like the chance to win this season. And if they don't, and if they sputter in the first or second round, then ultimately Doc will be, I don't want to say the scapegoat, because I think that he would be justified in firing him in this circumstance, but it would be a little bit of convenience for Daryl Morey for sure. So I just want to say that ultimately, I think the only way that Doc does get fired at the end of the season is there's got to go one of two ways. You either lose the trust of Harden or Embiid, one of the two. That's like number one. You fail so horribly in the playoffs, and it's obviously a coaching mistake. So if you're getting crushed by a Miami in the second round or a Boston in the second round. You're losing to Toronto or Chicago, which I don't think could ever happen unless there is, knock on wood, a Joel Embiid injury. I think that those are really the only circumstances in which Doc will get fired after the season. Like, I think that if they went to 7 with Milwaukee and it was a tough fought series, I think that there's a chance that Doc saves his job unless he loses the trust of Harden and Embiid.
So my question about this is about money, because if ownership thinks we're going to pay X, Y, and Z for luxury tax, and I think you and I talked about it made sense to retain George Hill even if he was washed, because you could trade that $10 million, but keeping him for $10 million would have cost total $40 million. If the ownership group is making that type of financial thinking, and if they're worried about maybe losing another $20 million to Ben Simmons, by the way, in this arbitration thing, is it possible that it's a big enough ask to say we want to max Harden or close to max Harden? We want to go well over the luxury tax threshold to support this team moving forward. Now we have to pay Ben Simmons, and also we want you to pay Doc Rivers, who's now fired. You just finished paying Brett Brown, and I want a new coach. Is it possible they'd say, okay, we'll do this, but that's coming out of your roster. Now you can't have this second round pick you wanted. You can't have this mid-level or biannual exception you wanted. So if it's possible that all that is the case, Daryl might say, I'd rather just run it back with Doc.
Yeah.
But when I'm thinking, like, if Daryl could do everything, if he was the owner, excuse me, he would rather make a coaching change, because I find it very hard to believe he thinks his chances are best right now and in 2023 with Doc as opposed to an alternative he could find.
I mean, think about all the coaches in the Eastern Conference, and this is something that I've brought up. You have Spoelstra, you have Udoka, you have Nurse, you have Bud, you have 3 guys who have won titles and been, Bud has improved as a coach, at least, even though I think that he still has his faults as a coach. Bud has improved as a coach. Spo's one of the best in the league. Nurse is one of the best in the league. And then you have Udoka, who's in his first year and has got the Celtics as the number 1 defense in the NBA and insane point differential and all that shit. And then you have Doc Rivers, who has had a lot of success in the regular season throughout his career. He's clashed with stars. He's proven to not improve when it comes to the playoffs. He's proven to get worse, if anything, when it comes to the playoffs. He's blown 3-1 leads. He's had falling out with the stars. I don't feel like the Sixers have a coaching advantage against any legit contender that is left. And I feel as though that is an extremely important part of not necessarily regular season basketball, but playoff basketball. And the fact that we're even having this conversation about a guy who has the MVP of the league, at worst, the guy who finishes in third for MVP. And we're having a conversation about the Toronto Raptors, who had one fringe all-star, and then Pascal Siakam, who's come on as of late, is a joke to me. And I think that you got to look at your team and you got to say, are we in this to win it? Are we in it to save money? And if Doc Rivers has a falling out or the team fails, and you can at least put a good chunk of the blame on Doc and they don't fire him because of money concerns, then the institutional issues are much larger than just Doc Rivers.
Yeah, I mean, we would have to, like you said, like obviously this would fall firstly on Doc's shoulders, but if they continued to roll with Doc and they didn't make roster changes, eventually we'd have to say, well, what are the knocks on Daryl Morey's legacy and history? He didn't know that a big who can't switch or shoot wasn't a problem, and he let that happen. And you know that he does know it because he's talked about it a million times. He's even talked about it in Philadelphia, saying we like to target bigs when he signed Charles Bassey, right, who can either switch or shoot. And so for that to be a downfall for maybe 2 seasons in a row in Philly would be crazy, especially given the history that he came in. The reason he's here essentially was overplaying Montrezl Harrell. So it's like he's demonstrated he's not going to make that change. Let me read you the latest. Your friend on your Discord, Baller SP, asked a question to Jake Fisher on the Please Don't Aggregate This podcast. Fisher's answer was really interesting. He was saying, like,
appropriately named podcast, by the way.
Yeah, so let me read this in case people haven't heard it yet. I think Philly, this is Fisher speaking, as they dropped a couple games in a row, and the whole aspect of the late game substitutions and rotations, his overall kind of stubbornness in his rotations and whatnot, there's definitely a lot of talk that he could end up being, if the Sixers are one of the teams that don't get to the conference finals, let alone the finals, ... I definitely think there's a scenario where Doc is the scapegoat, kind of similar to how Frank Vogel has been in LA. So when he says dropped a few games over the last, I think that sounds like the 3-game losing streak when we were all talking about Doc's issues. Joel Embiid talked about, the Giannis 14-point run in 4 Millsap minutes. Asked about the bench, and he brought up James Harden's struggles instead, unprompted. We were all talking about Doc Rivers at that point, but Jake Fisher implies to me that maybe someone more important than us fans was talking about the same issues too.
And I mean, I think that Frank Vogel has his faults as a coach as well. And I think that the situations are just completely uncomparable. Like, I think that what's happening with the Lakers right now is due to insanely poor roster construction,
right?
Due to LeBron James basically saying, I want to play with Russell Westbrook, even though Russell Westbrook has proven to not be really that good for years. And also him taking up a insane amount of cap when you also have these injury issues with Anthony Davis and just a very old, bad roster. And I think that Doc, on the other hand, has been given, once again, I'll say it 100 times, probably the MVP of the league. And he's been given all of these opportunities to prove to be flexible, play different guys, kind of figure out different rotations down the stretch of the season here, and he has simply refused to even try. And I think that Doc has been given the opportunities that Frank Vogel will not be given. And I think that when you think about the fact that, like, he's now being tied to the Lakers, which is just fucking hysterical to me. Like, LeBron, you think that Doc Rivers is going to fix this situation? Like, in Doc's history has he shown to be like, okay, maybe in the regular season he can, players respect him. He brings a new message or whatever. He gets along. He at least when he first gets to a place, he gets along with stars. All this shit. When it comes to the playoffs, that he's not going to do the things that you want from your coach, like. Vogel is a good defensive coach that will make adjustments and like pick the right personnel to put on the floor when you give him the chance in the playoffs, like he proved in the bubble. You have the fact that he had Ty Lue before that, who has been one of the best coaches at adjusting and figuring things out throughout the course of a playoffs. And then you have Doc Rivers, who's never going to do any of that stuff. But my favorite joke about all this that's come out of this is, like, Doc will finally get to go to a roster filled with 30-year-olds that he can just play like 40 minutes a game.
Yeah. And if LeBron was maybe 3 years behind the curve on Westbrook's decline. He might be about that on Doc if he wants him to replace him there, because I didn't want Doc as the coach for the Sixers for these reasons before they hired him. And I thought a lot of the reasons that the Clippers moved on from him were red flags, frankly, you know? And so if you had those concerns, he's proven you right in a lot of ways. He's validated what your concerns were coming in. And reading between the lines on everything you just said, I agree with you. I think Frank Vogel would be scapegoated and Doc Rivers would not. And scapegoating wouldn't be the appropriate verb. I think that's what you're saying, and I agree.
Yeah, I mean, I think the situations just aren't really that comparable when you consider the rosters, the injury issues that the Lakers have had, even though I think that Frank Vogel isn't the perfect coach. I think that he was not given the opportunities to succeed in the same way that Doc Rivers has been given in Philadelphia in 2 seasons now. And ultimately, hey, maybe they go on an Eastern Conference Finals run. Maybe they upset Milwaukee in round 2 or Brooklyn or whoever they face in round 2. Miami, I don't know, maybe they crush Miami and things are great and they can figure these things out over the course of the next few weeks or months. But if it does come down to that, let's say the Sixers get to the Eastern Conference Finals or the finals and Doc is still here. Lakers, I want all of your picks for Doc. You can have Doc and Tobias.
Yes.
Send Westbrook somewhere else. We'll take the cap space.
Yes.
Give us any pick you can trade us. You have 2 first-round picks, I believe, you can trade after this season, and we'll talk. Because, he's still under contract. Doc Rivers might get us to the conference finals. I'm just saying. Like, he's won a finals before. He's a top 15 coach of all time. I'm not 15. Just trading him for nothing.
Top 15. No, I think if the Sixers lose, let's say they lose in the second round to Milwaukee, or Boston, which would hurt even more for a Sixers fan, especially seeing Udoka. I mean, the narratives would be off the charts there. I think that Daryl Morey's play would be to work with James Harden, will have a lot of leverage before he signs his contract. Harden can go to management and say, I want to be here, but I don't want to play for this coach. He doesn't, enhance my playing style. And Morey could encourage James Harden to do that. This isn't reporting at all. This is my pure speculation. I think that if Daryl Morey wanted it to happen and needed to exert a little bit of pressure on ownership to get them to cough up the big bucks, back up the Brinks for all this, I think that would be the move. And I don't think they would have I don't think they would have Joel pushing back despite winning an MVP potentially, because if they lost in this scenario, he probably had to witness some carnage happen whenever he sat on the bench.
Exactly. I think that ultimately the Sixers will probably win whatever minutes Joel's on the court. And I think that he can see the faults of he's starting to see the fault. Like, I know that apparently they have a very good relationship. They apparently Doc and him get along great. And he supported him through all the Ben stuff. So I think that's important for Joel. But I also think that his ultimate goal is a title. His ultimate goal is to get the team over the top. And if he feels like if there's a second straight year where they lose to an inferior team, or they're just not playing up to their potential, like the guys who from Pound the Rock, who I'm going to have on the podcast next week, they're Toronto guys, but they talked about how they feel as though the Sixers are the most boom or bust team in the playoffs, where they could see them somehow losing in the first round to a team that they shouldn't lose to due to the things that we've talked about, the depth issues, Doc Rivers, Harden not looking the same, all of that shit, the clunkiness, the figuring out the fifth starter, all that. And then there's also a world where Joel Embiid can run through the Eastern Conference and they could make the finals or win the finals. Like there's a lot of outcomes here. And I think that a lot of it will come down to surviving those non-Joel minutes, which once again feels like 2018, 2019. It feels like last year. It feels like the same things that we've talked about over and over. And maybe I'm getting a little bit of PTSD here from all of that stuff, but it does feel very similar to the last few seasons where the Sixers looked like they had a legit shot and they just couldn't really put things over the top because of everyone that is not Joel Embiid, basically. And I think that's maybe one of the reasons why I've been a little bit concerned about Harden with the passiveness and once again, great playmaker. He's setting up everyone. The Sixers are fucking amazing offensively the last few games, especially when they're playing against these weaker defenses. And I think a large part of that is due to James Harden's playmaking and passing, and I think that he's even better at it than Ben Simmons was in his role. But it does give me a little bit of concern just because of the fact that, we brought him here to be not only just a playmaker passer, but also someone who can create their own shot in late game situations. Like, he's proven that he has been able to in some games, and then in other games not been able to kind of orchestrate the offense and get us a quality shot at the end of games. I think that it's clear he's, if not lost a step, still recovering from the injury. So that brings me to this question that I wanted to bring up to you on the air, which is basically, do you think that the Sixers, I don't even want to say regret the Harden trade, but do you think that they're starting to be more like eyebrow raising about the Harden trade, when it happened, why it happened, everything since then? Because, if the alternative to me was keeping Ben Simmons to the deadline and running this team, I'm not regretting it at all. Watching the Pacers game, it was probably the first time where a thought creeped into my head. Watching Tyrese Halliburton, and I don't think he's once again a destroyer of worlds. I think as a primary option, James Harden is still the better option. But part of me is would they have been better off getting Tyrese Halliburton to make a decent run this year, whether it's the same stuff that we're talking about now, second round, conference finals? Would they have been better off getting pieces that fit around Joel Embiid, like Tyrese Halliburton, and keeping Maxey, and then maybe trading Seth Curry for a wing, or trying to figure out a way to kind of bolster their depth that they already had, get Halliburton and picks for flexibility going into the summer, which is something that we've talked about. I don't know how you feel about that. I still think I'd say go for the Harden thing, because the upside of the Harden thing is you win the finals. I think that the upside of a Halliburton thing is probably you make the conference finals. And I think that ultimately the risk was worth it. But now you're looking at having to super max James Harden at his age with, maybe a little bit of, not compromise, basically a compromised version of him. Do you think that the Sixers regret it? And are you starting to be a little bit concerned yourself?
I don't know how to answer if they regret it, but I would guess that if Daryl Morey was honest with himself, that he could see the case for that Halliburton deal instead. I don't know what the Halliburton deal was. I did hear that there was a possibility for a Bradley Beal deal that was maybe derailed with his wrist injury. But I think that I personally would regret both of those. I mean, right now, if you magically had 4 picks and you attach them to James Harden for Halliburton straight up, I think Indiana might say no.
So hold on. We're trading 4 picks and James Harden for Tyrese Halliburton?
If you could just magically do that and it worked financially, I mean, it's possible in my mind that the Pacers would say no.
Well, yeah, but that's also circumstantial, right?
So then disregard the hypothetical, but I'm just illustrating the point that
who has more value on the open market right now is a better question to ask.
That's better then.
Right, because you could go into the summer with Halliburton, Maxey on rookie deals. You could have maybe potentially another open slot to get someone else. I don't know who, but whatever it is. And you could have gone into this summer with those picks, with Tyrese Halliburton, with Tyrese Maxey, and if Donovan Mitchell asks out or Star X asks out, you can be in the ballpark for that guy. The reason why I feel fine having Harden right now is because I still feel as though if he can kind of get things right, I know that there's some of it is small sample, some of it is shooting variance, some of it is the strength of the defenses that the Sixers and the strength of the teams that the Sixers are going against. But ultimately, I do the numbers are the numbers, and the Sixers have a 124 offensive rating with Joel Embiid and James Harden on the court. And that is by far the best offensive rating in the NBA in terms of you would just run teams off the court if you could put up a 124 offensive rating every night. It would be the best in NBA history by a pretty wide margin. So I don't know if Halliburton would be able to provide you with that. So the Harden trade gives you a shot now, and who knows what they can pull off this offseason, whether it's getting rid of the Tobias Harris contract, rebuilding the team, maybe Harden gets a little bit healthier, Maxey gets better going into next season. Joel always seems to come back a little bit better. So maybe that we look at this from a year from now and go, well, that was stupid. We were even worried about that.
Yeah, if Harden, to me, it's about the hamstrings, and I use the Chris Paul analogy. I'm sure you have too. Chris Paul sustained a grade 2 hamstring, and then the following year he had compensation injuries, and he shook both of those. Harden, if he follows that same path where he had the grade 2 in 2021 and he had the lesser one of the other hamstring this season, if he can shake both of those, Chris Paul had to go plant-based. My brother's into this stuff. He would say the
I'm
best
vegan
benefit
too, so yeah.
he would say the best benefit to going plant-based is you're probably eradicating a whole pile of crap that you're eating, although there are ways to do it healthily without going fully plant. Like, you could have wild fish and whatever. But yes, it might be losing 12 pounds. It might be getting on a full off season of Simon Rice's program. And then he could make these conversations ridiculous. But these conversations right now are not ridiculous because there's also the chance that he comes back looking like this version of himself or worse over the next 2 years.
Yeah, there is a downside to this, and this was a risk, and I think ultimately it was a risk worth taking because of the situation that the Sixers were in, but it has
100%,
creeped into
100% worth taking. We should say that
Yes.
like 3
Yes.
times.
Exactly. Like, and I don't deviate from my opinions at the time of the trade. I still feel as though it was the right move at the time. I feel as though I was genuinely excited for the team and how everything, could have went. And those first 5 or 6 games, I was like, this is amazing. And then even if you look at, and this is kind of a weird time of the season in terms of like people really being tuned into the NBA because like no one really seems to care once March Madness starts. But I can even see it in the people that listen and view stuff in terms of like interest in the Sixers. Post deadline, everyone was like, let's fucking go, whatever. The Nets game is really where the interest dipped a little bit because you saw them up against a really good opponent and they got fucking punched in the mouth. And you're like, is it the same old Sixers? I think over the course of the last few weeks, I've actually been encouraged since the Nets game, I should say. The Nets game was bad, and I was like, fuck, this sucks. But since then, the way that they competed against the Suns, the way that they competed against the Bucks, and the way that they've seemingly just beat teams that they should, except for that weird Detroit game, I ultimately do think that I'm somewhat positive about the team, even though I spend every podcast saying how negative I feel about the team. I'm somewhat positive in terms of how that they can compete going into the playoffs. But I do think that there's definitely a little bit of skepticism in my mind in terms of it is a scary thing to, give that much money to a guy like James Harden at his age. But ultimately, it's kind of something you have to do because let's say we get to the offseason and Harden was, like walked or wanted to get signed and traded somewhere else or whatever. The Sixers they'd be fucked basically because they have no way to really generate enough cap space. Like they could technically, I guess, sign Bradley Beal, but like at that point, you've already gotten rid of all your depth. And like, I always was a go for Harden over Beal guy, even though I like Beal and I think Beal's a good player. I'm still skeptical of like Maxey, Beal, and Maxey, Beal, and Embiid being the 3 best players on a title team. The Harden fit from a playmaking passing perspective made a lot more sense to me. It's ultimately, it's like if Harden can get back to the point where he's shooting even threes normally, like above average from 3, he doesn't even need necessarily all the other elements of his game, the finishing at the rim, the ability to get by guys, to be like at a high level for the Sixers to make some sort of run and prove that he is, I don't even know if I want to say worth that contract, but worth keeping as the second guy with Joel Embiid.
Yeah. I mean, I agree with all that. Jake Fisher brought up the scenario of James Harden taking a pay cut, and he mentioned Bradley Beal in the same breath. I wonder if there's some super team dreams here for Daryl Morey in the offseason, if they could persuade Beal to do that and then, use some NFT loopholes off the table to make up the money he was leaving. That would make whatever concerns we had about James Harden feel a lot less. Like, then he could be the 3rd best guy or the 4th best guy or whatever. And that would all be fine the way we used to talk about, a couple of years ago that the Sixers lost. I feel like they lost to the Raptors, and that was the game everyone was like, hey, Elton, do something. And then he traded for Tobias Harris. Remember that?
Yeah, I do remember that. Yeah, that was the night. Yeah, that I remember waking up the next morning to the Tobias trade.
Yeah. So I feel like you're right. I feel like the Sixers have a run. I would say the Nets are probably a little bit more boom or bust than the Sixers are here because they could actually lose in the play-in somehow. I mean,
True.
chances are they'll run the table and be the 7th seed and make life bad for some 2 seed. Hopefully they take Milwaukee to 7 and both teams are like limping at the finish line.
Yeah.
Um,
I don't feel as great about the Nets as I did a little bit ago. I'm not gonna lie. I
Definitely
think
an
that
uphill battle. Seth Curry, they're talking about him the way you just were about James Harden. Like, even if we rested him through the play-in, we're not sure that would fix his what's an off-season ankle issue. And you're like, man, Daryl Morey traded a bunch of stuff that's not playing.
it's weird because it's like, and I've joked about this with Reed Wallach, who was on the trade deadline show when we did during Slot Fest, and he was the one who I was talking to when the actual trade went down, and I was celebrating, and he was like, "Oh no." And he was like, I think about, we both were like, we think about this a lot because it's somehow this trade has not really moving forward. You could argue that the Nets, with their flexibility and all that stuff, and like having the 2 extra first round picks and having a little bit of bolstered depth with and hurting the Sixers depth at the same time, might have come out a little bit better than I had anticipated at the time of the trade. But ultimately they haven't had Ben Simmons play for them. Seth Curry is injured now, and Andre Drummond, who's looked great for the Nets, has been really the only guy who's regularly contributed. It's kind of a weird, feels like a neutral trade right now for both teams, which I would not have expected at all. The reaction was the Nets actually won the trade afterwards from the large majority of people. I think that Sixers fans were like, this is fucking insane. And then, of course, you get to see Harden play for a little bit, and you're like, we fleece them. It's not even close. And now Ben might not even come back. There's just so many question marks with Brooklyn where I feel as though I can't remember a situation, and maybe there is a situation that I'm just forgetting, but I can't remember a situation where a team they were missing a max player, a guy who made nearly 20 million. They're missing a guy who only makes 8 million in Seth Curry. So you're missing Ben Simmons, Joe Harris. You're missing like 50 to 60 million dollars in salary, and Seth Curry, I would say, is more like a 20 million dollar player in terms of what value that he brings to a team. So that's like really like 70 million in salary, and then they just overcome that and they're able to like figure it out. And a lot of teams do not have Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving, but the way that the Nets defense has looked the last month or so, outside of maybe the Heat game and the Sixers game, has made me think that this team might be more likely to be headed for a first round exit than to make the finals, which is the boomer bust thing that you're talking about.
Yeah, I think that's a fair way to look at it. I mean, their road to the finals is ridiculous. They would straight up have to win their playing games, and then they'd have to beat 3 of the 4 best teams in the East, essentially. So
if the play-in started right now, they would play the Cavs. So I think they'd win that just because the Cavs have their own injury problems. Jared Allen might not even be back for the plan. Evan Mobley's coming back. They've been very injured down the stretch of the season. So let's just say they win that. They get the
yeah,
7 seed. They go up against the 2 seed, who it's looking like it could be the Sixers, but it's looking like it's going to be the Bucks or the Celtics, depending on who wins that Bucks Celtics game. So you have to play either Milwaukee or Boston in the first round, and then probably the other one in the second round if you win the first round series. And then
Basketball Reference likes the Celtics to get the 2 seed right now.
okay.
So let's say the Nets visit there. That's the one team of the other big contenders that they haven't like had a statement win against very recently. They got a
Yeah.
win in Milwaukee without Kevin Durant. Irving went nuts for 38. They destroyed the Sixers in the Heat recently, but the Celtics have beaten them. It would be different without Robert Williams because I think he's very, very valuable. But
I agree.
it looks like it would go 7 to me.
So you have Boston. Let's say they face Boston in the first round, Milwaukee in the second round, and then the winner of Sixers Heat, maybe Raptors, probably Sixers or Heat. Then you're looking at, like you said, like you're looking at a path where they could, just to get to the finals, they'll have to, without all the guys that they're missing, or maybe Seth Curry plays injured, you're looking at a path for the Nets that is harder than one that I can ever remember for a team with all the question marks that they have. And I do think that part of the Harden trade, and I still stand by this, even though the only reason Harden was available in the first place was because of the injury and because of the clashing and all of that stuff. Because I think if Harden looked like Harden, the Nets would have been running teams off the court this year and they wouldn't have even had these issues.
Yeah, I don't think Harden would have wanted to leave because he was balling.
Right, exactly. So I think that the reason why they might have done that trade might have been because they had their own concerns about this year in the first place, because of where they were positioned, because Kevin Durant was injured at the time, because of the fact that Harden wanted out, because of the fact that they didn't know if Joe Harris was coming back. They probably thought that he was done for the season, that this trade might have been more for next year than it was for this year. And they repositioned themselves by getting those extra first round picks, by getting, maybe if Ben Simmons had come back, I think that if Ben Simmons had come back and looked fine and was healthy and whatever, they'd have a legit shot at being contenders. Because I think even though as flawed as Ben is and like as much as he struggled in the playoffs before, I do think that he would be extremely important for having any semblance of a normal defense in the playoffs, because they just don't have anyone at the point of attack that they can trust to stay on the court that will regularly kind of go up against the Jason Tatums, the Giannis's, the guys that Ben has, Giannis not as much, but like guys that Ben has been able to keep in check defensively in the past. And I think that ultimately that their move might be for next season as opposed to this season. And I kind of feel the same way about the Sixers, where I feel like both teams are probably going to be better off heading into next year because they'll have a chance to retweak their rosters and kind of figure these things out. Whereas I feel like right now, if I had to make a pick, I'd pick Milwaukee to win the East. But I still don't think Milwaukee, and maybe they just don't care. Maybe they're just kind of phoning in the first 3 quarters of every game, which it seems like they do, and they really try in the fourth quarter, and that will be the playoff version of Milwaukee that we'll get. But I still don't see them like cruising to the finals. Like I still think that they're going to have series that are going to go 6 and 7. Like I just don't think that there is like I think the Celtics, if Robert Williams had stayed healthy, could have beat the Bucks. Like I don't think that they're this destroyer of worlds team that everyone seems like the narrative has seemingly shifted over the past month since they got Brook back and Giannis has looked amazing. It seems like the narrative has shifted from like a bunch of teams could win the East to like it's only Milwaukee now. And while I think they should probably be the favorite and I'd probably pick them to come out, I still feel like there's a good chance they could get upset by one of these teams.
Before I go give my thoughts on that, I would push back a little bit on the idea that the Nets have some resignation or more about next year. I do think the Nets would admit that right now they'd be better off with James Harden on the roster. Harden would have buoyed them so that they'd be 5 or 6 seed right now.
True.
They'd be out of this play-in, gauntlet. And if he's your third best player, you're pretty happy. You might even be okay, content risk losing him for nothing because that Ben Simmons deal is still sitting there waiting for you. And then you might have learned that maybe Ben had a flare-up trying to come back at some point, and you go another way. Maybe you can target Bradley Beal or whatever. I think they very much thought that even if Ben Simmons didn't provide them the value James Harden was, he was going to provide them some value this season. I don't think they saw this coming at all. But yeah, I do think that they like the idea of the moving forward element to it also, and the way that Harden might have aged on what they would have had to pay like $274
right
mil.
Crazy amount of money.
Yeah, and it works out for Harden because now he can get offered that by the Sixers, basically. So you see why he wanted it, and who knows how he would have reacted if he didn't get what he wanted, where we would all be today. In terms of the Bucks, I agree with you that a healthy Celtics team certainly had looked like they could have won the East. I know they broke 538's algorithm. They had them like massive favorites to win the finals, just period. Without that, I do think that it makes the Bucks comfortable favorites again right now. If they could somehow dodge the Nets in round 1, I would like their chances even more if they could foist Kevin Durant upon the Heat. But
we will know, by the way. I just want to say, we will know whether the Celtics, I don't even want to say like they're like matchup angling here, but they play the Bulls tonight and they play the Bucks tomorrow. If they beat the Bulls and then they sit guys against the Bucks on the second half of a back-to-back and they let the Bucks have that game, they're angling for Bucks Nets first round they get the Bulls probably. Although it is potential they could play the. See, this is where the wrench is thrown into things. Because if the Celtics do that and the Sixers win out, then the Sixers could end up the 3 seed. They get the Bulls, and then the Celtics end up playing the Raptors, and they could have unvaccinated players that can't play in Toronto.
I believe Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown have both indicated they're vaccinated, right?
All I'm going to say is, and I don't want Celtics fans to come at me with a knife here, is that Jaylen Brown's answer to this question is very vague. He has not come out and said, I'm vaccinated or I am not vaccinated.
Did he say
has said, No, he didn't. He didn't pull the Aaron Rodgers. I don't think he did. I think that he came out and he said, I missed the playoffs last year. I'm looking forward to the playoffs this year. And I'm looking forward to facing anyone that we could potentially face in the playoffs.
Okay.
And to me, that was they're like, well, he's part of the players union and and blah, blah, blah. And he wants to, he keeps saying like, I support every player's right to do whatever they want to do. And that's fine, but you can also still come out and say you're vaccinated. Like, I don't think we have any questions about Grant Williams, who is also part of that, or CJ McCollum, who I'm pretty sure have come out and said they are vaccinated. And there's at least question marks around a few guys on that roster, Jaylen Brown, Horford, about their vaccination status. And like, I don't know what it is, but I know that Brian Windhorst has suggested that and Woj have both suggested that it is possible that they're not. And if that's the case,
you're better off playing Brooklyn.
Yeah, because like, I mean, dude, you go to Toronto without those two, and Robert Williams isn't playing. Like, there's a very good chance for an upset in that series if they just steal one of the games in Boston. Even though I think Boston should win that series, that throws a huge wrench in things, and that throws a huge wrench in things for a lot of teams.
The best home court of all time.
Yeah, exactly. And the Sixers were the other team that did not respond to that Tim Bontemps thing. They basically said no comment.
Yeah, I saw people speculating on which end of bench guy that would be, and Zapruder, which Sixers missed the preseason game in Toronto or whatever.
So the mandate changed in January,
right?
So anything that happened earlier in the year, we might get a better idea since they play in Toronto tomorrow. But anything that happened early in the year is pretty much irrelevant in terms of who played in that Toronto game and who didn't. I don't want to name names, but you can kind of do a process of elimination on who it could potentially be. I think we know a few months ago, Keith Pompey said that he said that basically Ben Simmons and an end of bench player were unvaccinated. We know that James Harden and Paul Millsap are vaccinated because they played for the Nets and they played home games. So we know that both of them are vaccinated. We don't know about DeAndre Jordan, who they just got. We don't know about, but I think if Rob Pelinka
he was playing in LA, don't you have to be?
No, you don't.
Okay.
I looked this up. You do not have to be for the Lakers. The Lakers, I know this because Dwight Howard's on the team, and Dwight Howard has been pretty anti-vax for a while now. And I don't know if he got vaccinated. I'm not saying that he did or he didn't, but I know that he has been pretty anti-vax in his statements, and he's played all their games. And I know because I looked it up, and they did not fall under that rule, apparently, like the players in Golden State and Brooklyn and for the Knicks did. So there's that element of it. And then there's the element of there's one end of bench player that doesn't play in the rotation. So there are a few guys, and two of those guys are Jaden Springer and Paul Reed, and they both played a G League game in Toronto like a month ago.
Okay.
So process of elimination, there's only a few guys it could be, and none of them are in the rotation anyway. So from the Sixers perspective, I don't think that is really going to be a factor as it is.
Is it possible that it was a guy like Grant Riller who's not even around anymore or something?
It's possible. It's definitely possible. I don't even remember if Riller was on the team at the time.
Yeah,
I don't know if they had signed Miles Powell before then, or Charlie Brown Jr., whoever replaced him. But I do believe that it's possible that it could be someone that's no longer on the team that was an end of bench guy that just got cut. So who knows? I've heard a ton of shit being thrown around. I don't want to put any names to it, but if you do a little bit of process of elimination, you might find a few candidates of guys that it could be. And ultimately, I don't think it's going to affect a Sixers-Toronto series because I think that those guys aren't going to play in that series unless there's major injury anyway. And at that point, the Sixers are probably fucked as it is. So, right. Like, I mean, like you're right. Are you really going to worry all that much about that? So ultimately, I think that teams are probably going to be trying to get that. Like, I think for the first round, the 3 seed, everyone wants to play. Miami seems locked into the 1st seed. It seems like everyone wants to play Chicago because they are injured and can't beat good teams, and they're just kind of fraudulent as it is. And
Lonzo may not come back at all.
He's not. They already announced he's shut down for the year. So no Lonzo. No one's afraid of Chicago. I think everyone wants that. But once again, it could create harder second round matchups, as you will have to face Milwaukee, Boston, or possibly Philly, as opposed to, I think most teams would want to play Miami in the second round. Like, I know that Brooklyn would prefer to play Miami. I know the Sixers would definitely prefer to play Miami. I don't know if the Celtics and the Bucks care all that much about who they play. They might just say, we'll beat whoever's in front of us. But from a strategic standpoint, I think Miami is the more beatable team of the top 3 seeds as it currently stands, with the Sixers in 4th place, I believe.
I feel like I could be wrong, but I feel like the Milwaukee Bucks had the opportunity to dodge the Miami Heat last year and did not, and just throttle them in round 1. So they might feel,
and they beat the shit out of them in Miami too, by the way. Yeah. So they beat them in Miami to basically seal that they were going to face them in the first round, and then they swept them.
Yeah, and Giannis only played like 24 minutes, even with the scoring title up for grabs. He might just be thinking, I don't care who we play, I just want to be healthy going into the playoffs.
Exactly. And I think that they should have that confidence. They won the title last year. They've gotten seemingly better when everyone is healthy. I think that they should be the favorites, and I think that I don't think they should be worried about any matchup. I do worry that, like, because the Sixers, like, I keep thinking about like this Toronto matchup or this Brooklyn matchup or this Celtics matchup or this, like, if you're worried that much, your team's probably not a contender. So I think that the way that the Sixers should just do it is just win out, because I don't think you can try to matchup hunt and like get this team or that team and hope that you're gonna like cruise your way to an Eastern Conference Finals, because we have done that before. And I think that ultimately you just got to beat who's in front of you. And I think that if you lose in the first round because of an unfavorable matchup, you weren't winning the finals anyway, unless there's like some weird injury and like Joel misses the series or something. But in that case, you're not beating anyone. The Sixers suck without Joel, and to a lesser extent, James Harden on the court. So, all right, let's look at, I have a list here before we get out of here. I have the best to worst case playoff scenario rankings for the Sixers that I have for my own personal.
Okay.
I want to get your, okay. So number 1 is easy. Sixers win the title. This is the best case scenario. The Sixers win the title. James Harden looks great in the playoffs. Maxey is a playoff Maxey. Embiid wins finals MVP. We ride off into the sunset. I don't have to worry about this ever again. That's number 1. Highly unrealistic, but that's number 1. Number 2, Sixers get to the finals and they lose a close series to like the Suns or the Warriors or one of these really good teams, and I can feel fine about it. They go 6 or 7. They lose the series. Okay, that's fine. 3, the Sixers get to the finals and they get absolutely destroyed by one of those teams. Wouldn't feel great, but we still got to the finals. You know, it's something to build on. Go from there. Number 4, Sixers lose a tough ECF to Milwaukee or Brooklyn. I think those are the 2 teams that I think if you lose to Kevin Durant or Giannis, you can feel fine about it, even if it doesn't feel good at the time.
You sleep well. Yeah.
You're fine. You lose a tough ECF to one of those teams, whatever. You're chilling.
Probably talking about the rotations and backup center minutes.
Still, of course.
Yeah.
We will be for eternity. This is the hell we are stuck in. Number 5, I have the Sixers get crushed in the Eastern Conference Finals, but they beat one of the good teams on the way. So they beat Boston or they beat Milwaukee.
They beat Milwaukee Brooklyn, and then they get swept by the Heat or something.
Yeah, like they lose, but they have a good playoff series win under their belt that shows that they can be contenders moving forward.
Yeah.
I think that's fine, even though, oh God, losing to Miami, I puke all over myself. Then we have the Sixers lose in the second round to Milwaukee or Brooklyn. Once again, fine with it. If we lose to one of those teams, it would not, like, I mean, it would suck, but also like those teams they have all-time players, and I would be able to live with it. Then I have like a tier down, which is like, this is like my nightmare scenarios. This is everything
Yeah,
up to that point.
I'm interested to see if you get swept in the first round ahead of losing 7 in the second round to the Celtics.
Yeah, okay, so I don't, because I think Boston's really good, and I think that it would suck losing 3 times in the playoffs to the Celtics, but I think that I could live with losing to this team, especially if Robert Williams is back, more so than some of the other outcomes that would come from this playoffs.
Each one presents its own particular nightmare. Like Jimmy Butler, we had him, or
Yes.
or the
Toronto
James
all
Harden
over
trade,
again. Yeah.
or Al Horford defended Embiid well, just like 2018.
Yeah, exactly. There's kinds of flashbacks we can have in our brain with
Colangelo
this last
didn't
year.
get Tatum. Yeah.
Exactly. Then we have, so this is Sixers lose to Boston in the second round is my like seventh one, which is
Yeah.
in the
Tough.
nightmare. This is where the nightmares start. But ultimately I would be probably fine with that outcome. In the grand scheme of things, like I don't think that it means that the Sixers are frauds if they lose a tough series to Boston or whatever. Then I have the Sixers lose first round to Toronto under that, because this isn't my worst case scenario, even though I just discussed that we should not be even having this conversation, because I think the three problems would be really easy to diagnose with a loss in this series, which is Doc Rivers, DeAndre Jordan, or whoever the wash backup center he's going to play as, and the depth issues. I think those are the things that will rear their head in a series like that. And also, you have your solution moving forward: rebuild the depth, get a normal backup center, and get rid of Doc Rivers, which would be the silver lining of all of this, because I don't think that Doc Rivers is a good coach at all. In the playoffs, at least. Regular season, he's fine. Whatever. After that, I have Sixers lose first round to Chicago, which would be like, what the fuck happened?
Yeah.
Yeah, this is a DEF CON, because I'm like, this is a team we've owned. This is a team that's like, even before we lost to the Hawks in the playoffs, the Hawks kind of weirdly had our number with Trae Young. I don't know if you remember that, but they would beat us like 2 times a year. And I was like, how do we always lose to the fucking Hawks? Like, we have
Yeah.
never shown a sign of weakness against Chicago. Like, we beat them every time. The last time we beat them handily. And then the time before that, I believe we beat them handily too. Like, there's no reason we should lose to Chicago.
I could be wrong,
Series.
but I feel like writing like Trae Young is surprisingly just 3-3 against the Sixers, and that was when they were abysmal.
Yeah, exactly. Like, I remember this, which kind of brings me back to the 18-19 season, which I had mentioned at some point. The 18-19 parallels are very staggering. And one of the things was, down the stretch of that season, we lost to a Hawks team that was like a young but not good, and Trae Young was starting to figure things out. It's very similar to Cade Cunningham and the Pistons right now, where not a good team, but they play with a lot of energy. They're young. They tend to outrun and out hustle guys. Like, the Pistons loss was very reminiscent of those Hawks losses at the end of the 18-19 season. Although I don't believe Embiid played in those games, so at least we had that built-in excuse.
I don't want to derail you, so don't forget what you're about to say. But do you remember those rumors that the Sixers were thinking of trading Markelle Fultz and taking on Chandler Parsons' contract, parting with pick 10 in order to move up to pick 4 to maybe target Michael Porter Jr.? Like, that was a maybe.
Remember that. I vaguely remember that, but I do remember hearing that could have been a smokescreen.
Okay, maybe it was a smokescreen, but I always wonder, like, what was their all-in offer? We take Parsons, we offer like that, and so much more. Could we have gotten a pick 4 or 5 and landed maybe Trae Young?
So I think it was a smokescreen for this reason. Michael Porter Jr. fell to us, and we didn't draft him.
Right.
So I think the smokescreen was what our move was going to be, so we could move up to get, I believe it was Luka Doncic.
Okay.
Because Luka ended up going 3. The Hawks took a different offer because they had the 3rd pick. Remember, they traded.
They got to go to 5, and then had the
they got Trae and they got picks and whatever. So they took a different offer. But I do believe that the Sixers were targeting someone else. I don't know if it was Luka or if it was Trae or who it was. But if they really wanted Michael Porter Jr., they could have just taken him. So I never believed that after the draft. So, I mean,
just curious about the availability of pick 4 or pick 5.
I'm curious too, because I don't really think that Jaren Jackson Jr. was someone that was like I think the Grizzlies wanted him, but I think that if they could have gotten off the Parsons contract and maybe gotten, I don't know if a prospect like Fultz would have been intriguing to them, but maybe a future first and 10, like that front office at the time, I believe that was right before they hired their current GM. 2018
Fultz had
draft.
one of his worst weird spasms in Memphis. Maybe they were spooked by that. I don't know.
Yeah, that's possible. But also, I could be wrong here. Maybe Zach Kleinman and their whole front office changed that offseason, but I don't know if it did. I think it might have been a little bit after that. And I think that draft was the last Hollinger draft with the Grizzlies in 2018. So it's possible that front office had a very process-brained kind of thing. So like moving back and getting an extra pick and getting off a bad contract or whatever might have been more preferable to them. I don't know. I'm not really sure, but that's an interesting what if sliding doors moment. Because I always think about like what if they moved up and they just took Luka, but like also they had Ben on the team at the time, so like maybe that was just all bullshit and it was never really true. But all right, so I have my last one. So I had all of those things. Lose first round to Chicago would be a nightmare. Lose first round to Toronto would be a nightmare. Lose second round to Boston in my nightmare tier. The number one thing that I would like absolutely fucking hate my life if this happened would be if they lost to the Miami Heat. Because I think that I have my own personal issues with, you brought up Jimmy Butler. I hate the whole culture thing. I hate everything about Miami. I even now, anytime I'm sad, I have Heat fans in my mentions. I've had to block like 50 of them because I was having a fun time. Since we recorded the Heat Pack episode, the Heat have not lost a game. I think it's been 4 or 5 in a row that they've won. So joke's on me. But losing to Miami in the second round would just kind of be the most insufferable imaginable exit that I could have from this, especially because like I think that the seeds of I think a loss to Miami or Boston in the second round would really plant the seeds in Joel's mind to be like, damn, maybe it's never going to happen here. And that is the thing that we should worry about the most out of this playoffs, which is if they don't win, whatever, like I hope they compete and I hope that they look good and I hope they can go up against some good teams and look like contenders. But if Joel starts to wonder, did I make a mistake signing this extension? That's the real nightmare scenario. And I think a loss to Chicago or Miami in the second round or Boston would be the things that kind of plant the seeds in his brain for that.
Yeah, it would be hard. I mean, it would force us to come to grips with even if you would give Daryl Morey an A+ for turning the Ben Simmons situation into James Harden, which, you know, you or I were probably prepared to accept much, much lesser return at the time.
Oh, absolutely.
Regardless of what we feel about James Harden right now, we would have been absolutely thrilled at this. And still, their title odds or their roster itself isn't nearly as good as if they had simply run it back with Jimmy Butler a couple of years ago. No matter how good Daryl Morey could be, they were in a really good spot. And those collaborative years in between Sam Hinkie and Daryl Morey, it's possible that doomed this team moving forward to the point of no return. Maybe Joel would start to think that, and we fans would have to think about that too. So absolutely,
right. I don't want the existential crisis loss.
Right. That's what that would be. Some of the Celtics scenarios proves the exact same point in terms of Horford being there and Tatum torturing you, all these guys that we either had but didn't want or wanted but didn't have.
Oh, we'll hear the Tatum is better than Embiid arguments. Yep.
Yeah, and the coach stuff, having had Ime.
Yep. Yeah, so those are my nightmare scenarios. I hope that one of the dream scenarios happens, preferably one of the first two. But
the absolute dream would be you beat the Nets, the Bucks, the Celtics, and the Suns somehow.
You run through every team that has given you nightmares. You beat the best of the best. There's no argument against it. And once again, I'm titling this episode, Joel Embiid is dragging the Sixers to the finish line. It's going to come down, like, we can talk about all the other things and maybe they lose the Joel minutes, the non-Joel minutes. And, you know, we're worried about Harden and Doc and everything that has seemingly gone wrong with the team instead of focusing on the positives. But once again, this will be a legacy defining playoffs for Joel Embiid. he's had, I think that they still win the minutes with him, but he's had some not great moments in the playoffs, and he hasn't really had that signature series win or signature run that will cement him as one of the greatest basketball players of all time, even though I think he already is. So I think that this is a big moment for Joel, and I think that whenever you're on next, whether it's in the offseason or sometime in the playoffs, we will hopefully remember this run as the Joel Embiid run, and that the Sixers will live and die with Joel Embiid. And he needs to prove that he's on the same level as KD and Giannis and guys who have proven it in the playoffs before. That's what it comes down to me.
James Harden needs his Peyton Manning 2014 Super Bowl II here. You don't have to be your old 2013 self. You don't have to be Indianapolis Peyton, but you got to lead the team the right way. You got to read a defense better than anyone else can read a defense and call a short pass or a running back play and beat the vaunted Panthers defense. So Harden needs that too. I already have him up there historically with guys like Dwayne Wade and Dirk Nowitzki, but he doesn't have that ring. So I realize there's a flaw in that legacy argument for sure. He can fill that.
Yeah, that's honestly the perfect analogy. That's a great place to end it. Thank you so much, Dave, for coming on. I love that analogy so much, and I will be using it and stealing it moving forward. So you can follow Dave in the description, all of his stuff on Liberty Ballers, Clutch Point, all that shit. Dave, he will be on the podcast as a regular, and really appreciate your time, dude.
I got to get you on a Liberty Ballers one. I'll do maybe a special one hopefully soon.
Let's do it. Let's get it. Oh man. The one thing about the Sixers, either whether they win or lose in the playoffs, is there will be slop waiting on the other side for us.
We got a healthy dose of slop from Jake Fisher a couple days ago in season.
That's what I'm saying. We're getting no trade deadline slop now. It's beautiful. I absolutely love it, folks. So
Doc to the Jazz slop now.
We're getting Jazz slop too. Donovan Mitchell, Gobert. It's slop don't stop, as they say.
Yeah, my Knicks fans text circuit is lit with Donovan Mitchell right now.
All right, Dave. I gotta get out of here. Peace.
Thank you.